What if the quietest person on your flight turned out to be the most powerful one on board? On a routine trip from Atlanta to London, a simple seat dispute spirals into a moment that will shake an entire airline to its core. But no one saw it coming, because she never raised her voice. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos that morning. Hartsfield Jackson Atlanta International was never really quiet. People wheeled their bags like soldiers dragging gear. Boarding announcements echoed over tinny speakers, and the scent of overbrewed coffee floated in the air like an old song nobody liked, but everyone recognized. Still, somehow, she moved through it all unnoticed. Mailing Kersey had long ago grown used to blending in. That morning, she wore a long charcoal coat, neat slacks, low-heeled shoes, and her favorite glasses. The frames were simple, thin, silver, a little scuffed near the hinge, but they helped her think clearly. Her black hair was pulled into a neat bun. There was nothing flashy about her, but everything about her was composed. She ordered a small black coffee from a kiosk, skipped the sugar and cream, then walked to gate 47. There, she found an empty seat by the window, away from the crowd. The glass looked out over the tarmac, where ground crew bustled in heavy jackets, bathed in the pale glow of early winter sunlight. She slid her laptop bag beneath her seat, pulled out a weathered paperback, and flipped it open to a dog-eared page. For a moment, it looked like she was just another businesswoman killing time before a flight. But mailing wasn't here for business as usual. Not anymore. Last month, she'd accepted her new title, Director of Passenger Experience Oversight at the International Passenger Federation, or IPF. A big title for a big job. Her first assignment, to ride a long-haul flight undercover and evaluate Voyage Airlines, one of the biggest names in transatlantic travel. They didn't know she was coming. That was the point. 15 years in the air taught her more than any executive orientation ever could. She knew the tiny things passengers noticed, but rarely voiced. She also knew what they endured, especially those who didn't fit a certain mold. This inspection was personal, but not for revenge. It was about accountability. At 8:05, boarding began. Mailing waited until most passengers had lined up. When she rose from her seat, she tucked her book into her coat pocket and moved with quiet assurance toward the gate. Her boarding pass had one word that used to seem distant: business. As she stepped onto the plane, the cabin air hit her with that familiar dry chill, a scent of worn fabric metal, and something chemical trying to smell fresh. She located her seat, 3A, a window seat. She stored her bag in the overhead, settled in, and buckled her belt. Then she saw him, the flight attendant. White, mid-30s, perfectly pressed uniform, a name tag that read Derek Voisin. He glanced over at her, not the quick look most crew gave while counting heads. This was longer, slower. His eyes flicked from her face to her coat to the seat number overhead. Then he turned to a female colleague and leaned in. He whispered something too low to hear, but the glance he gave back toward Maylene said enough. She didn't flinch. When Derek returned, he put on a thin smile. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass again?" he asked, already holding his tablet as if he expected trouble. She reached into her coat pocket and handed it to him. He studied it for longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said flatly. "Just verifying. We've had a few issues with upgrades lately." Maylene tilted her head. "Of course. Would you like to verify it with a supervisor? I'm happy to wait." Her voice was soft, even so calm it almost felt rehearsed. She smiled politely, but something in her eyes stopped Derek short. He stared at her for half a beat longer, then handed back the pass and walked away without another word. Across the aisle, an older man in a blazer and loafers gave her a side glance. He looked like he wanted to say something, maybe joke about how things were different now, but she turned toward the window before he could speak. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, clear, quiet, unshaken. This wasn't her first time being underestimated. It probably wouldn't be the last. But this time, she wasn't just riding coach. And she wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to see if the system could still recognize dignity when it didn't come dressed in a suit. As the aircraft doors sealed shut and the jet engines rumbled to life, Maylene exhaled slowly. Outside the window, the tarmac rolled past, cold and gray. Inside her chest, something steadier stirred. Resolve. Focus. Stillness. The plane had been in the air for no more than 30 minutes when Derek came back down the aisle, this time holding a tablet tight to his chest like it carried a secret too hot to touch. "Excuse me again, ma'am," he said, his voice clipped but trying too hard to sound casual. "There's been a glitch in our system. I just need to double-check your boarding information." Maylene looked up from her book, calmly closing it with a finger marking the page. She had expected this, maybe not this soon, but it didn't surprise her. "Sure," she said, her tone measured. She handed over her boarding pass again, the same one he had already scanned and looked at before takeoff. He stood there longer than necessary, tapping on the tablet, pretending to scroll through something important. She could feel it, the weight of a performance. A few rows ahead, someone shifted in their seat. A man across the aisle raised an eyebrow without turning his head. Nobody said anything. That was always the way, wasn't it? Maylene kept her posture steady, hands folded on her lap. But inside, her mind was walking backward, retracing steps from years ago, back when she wore the uniform instead of sitting in seat 3A. She remembered those long-haul flights from Atlanta to Frankfurt, from Dallas to Tokyo. She remembered how many times she'd seen other passengers get the same look Derek was giving her now. Sometimes it was subtle, sometimes it wasn't. A raised eyebrow, a forced smile, a lingering doubt. She remembered one night when a supervisor told her, "Just stay polite. It's easier that way." But easier didn't mean right. Back then, she hadn't had the title. She hadn't had the authority. All she had was her instincts and a long line of reasons not to speak up. But today was different. "Looks like everything checks out," Derek finally muttered. "Must have been a sync error." She nodded, not bothering to respond. He turned and walked away with that same polite stiffness, as if he was still looking for something wrong that he couldn't quite put a name to. 2 rows down, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, dark curls tucked behind her ears, looked back toward Maylene, then quickly away. There was that flicker of discomfort, of silent witnessing. Still, no one spoke. Trenton, he was doing his routine pass, heading toward the back of the plane. As an onboard security officer, his job was mostly uneventful. Make sure things stayed quiet. Step in when they didn't. Usually he just nodded, smiled, kept moving. That was the protocol. But today he paused. He had noticed Derek return to the same passenger twice. That was unusual, especially in business class. He caught a glimpse of Maylene's face as he passed, unbothered on the surface, but her eyes didn't lie. They weren't angry, just tired, like they'd seen this before and already knew how it would play out. Back in the galley, Trenton leaned toward one of the flight attendants. Her name tag read Mara. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low, "the woman in 3A. She looks familiar. I think I saw her at a security seminar last fall. IPF hosted it in D.C. Mara frowned slightly. She said she works with a nonprofit. Quiet lady. Why? Trenton shrugged. No reason. Just, I remember faces. And hers stuck. He let the thought hang in the air before grabbing a bottle of water and heading back up the aisle. He didn't say anything more, but something about her stayed with him. The way she hadn't looked down. The way she'd held her gaze, not defiant, not challenging, just grounded. Like she'd come prepared. Back in her seat, Maylene reopened her book, but she wasn't reading. The words blurred on the page. She was asking herself a question she hadn't had to face in a while. If I weren't who I am, would I still have sat here, calm as I am now? The answer wasn't clear. And maybe that was the part that stung. But this wasn't the time to answer it. Not yet. She glanced out the window again. Nothing but clouds, soft and endless. Somewhere below them, the world kept spinning. Up here, time slowed just enough for truths to take shape. The meal trays had just been cleared. Coffee was still warm in paper cups, and the cabin lights had dimmed to a soft amber, giving the illusion of calm. Most passengers were settling into movies or books or naps. It was the quiet stretch of any flight, the in-between, where time felt suspended. But not for Aileen. Derek appeared again, this time with a tighter jaw and the kind of posture that suggested something more than customer service. He wasn't smiling. His tablet was in one hand, and in the other a printed sheet. There was a tension in his step that made Aileen sit up straighter even before he reached her row. "Ma'am," he began, voice louder than it needed to be. "I'm going to need you to stand up for a moment." Aileen blinked once, not startled, but measuring him. "Why?" "There's been an incident," Derek replied, glancing around like he had an audience. And he did. "We've identified a duplicate seat code used in economy class. Your boarding pass matches that entry. It may be a technical error, or it may indicate fraud." The word hung there. Fraud. There was a slight intake of breath from the man across the aisle. Someone further back rustled their blanket. Nobody said anything, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate. It was like someone had opened a window and let in a draft of suspicion. Aileen's tone stayed even. "You're accusing me of stealing this seat?" "I'm saying the system shows a conflict," Derek replied, standing firm. "We need to verify that you're in the right place." She stared at him for a moment, searching his eyes. Not for kindness. She knew it wasn't there, but for motive. What was he hoping she'd do? Lose her temper? Give him a reason to escalate? "I showed you my boarding pass twice," she said quietly. "And I haven't moved from this seat." Derek didn't back down. "Protocol, ma'am." She nodded once, slow. Then she asked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Would you like to call security?" That threw him off balance for a second. Just long enough. "I'll do just that," he said and walked off. A few heads turned now. One woman, in her 60s, frowned toward the front of the cabin. A younger man leaned into the aisle slightly, as if to get a better view. Aileen remained still. Her heart wasn't racing, but there was a tightening in her chest. Not from fear, not even from anger, just that familiar, bitter recognition. Here it was again. That moment when your dignity got placed on a scale and someone else decided what it weighed. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. "Trenton, you showed up 2 minutes later, stepping into the tension like someone stepping onto ice." He didn't speak right away. His eyes moved from Derek to Aileen, then back again. He wasn't the kind to make snap judgments, but his instincts were ringing like a bell. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I'm Officer Yu. Is everything okay here?" "She's in a seat that might have been duplicated," Derek said, cutting in. "I thought it best to bring you in for safety reasons." Trenton raised an eyebrow, then looked at Aileen. "My boarding pass has been verified twice," she said plainly. "But if you'd like to see it a third time, I'm happy to oblige." Trenton held out his hand gently, and she passed the digital boarding stub to him. He scanned it quickly with his phone, watching the screen. A beat passed. "No red flags here," he said. "I don't see any alerts." Derek's mouth tightened. "Then maybe it hasn't updated yet." Trenton didn't bite. Instead, he stepped slightly closer to Aileen and lowered his voice. "Would you prefer we handle this privately? I can request a quiet conversation upon landing with a rep from the airline." Aileen gave him a long look, reading the tone behind his words. It was careful, but not without understanding. He wasn't on her side, but he wasn't blindly on Derek's either. "That would be appreciated," she replied. Derek stood awkwardly for a moment, then muttered something about checking again with ground systems and walked off. Aileen waited until he was out of earshot, then reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and opened a secure communication app she'd used only twice before. Her fingers hovered for just a second before she typed. Subject: Flight 0062, a merry voyage. Situation escalating. Visibility compromised. Possible intervention needed upon arrival. She hit send. And just like that, the quiet observer was gone. Inside the cabin, the hum of the engines blended with the faint rustling of magazines, clinks of glasses, and the low murmur of passengers speaking in half-hushed tones. The flight had found its rhythm again, that long middle stretch when hours felt both slow and oddly suspended. But in seat 3, Time was ticking in a different way. Maylene had just sent the message. She knew it would land in the right hands. At a regional operations hub near Heathrow, her encrypted transmission pinged onto the secure line of the International Passenger Federation's team. Deanna Roth was sitting in a conference room when it arrived. She recognized the sender before even reading the subject. Flight 0062. Situation escalating. Deanna didn't hesitate. She'd been trained for this. Actually, she'd been trained by Maylene herself. That woman had taught her the difference between reacting and responding, between making noise and making change. Without a word to the rest of the room, Deanna quietly packed her tablet, zipped up her carry-on, and messaged Heathrow operations. By the time she stepped off the train at Terminal 5, she was already rerouting to Gate 9. Back on the plane, Maylene hadn't moved. She sat still, her fingers lightly clasped in her lap. But her thoughts weren't still. They spun, calculated, reevaluated. This wasn't about her anymore. Hadn't been for a long time. This was about precedent. About whether power could still hold its tongue long enough to be meaningful. She glanced across the aisle. Derek was whispering something to the younger flight attendant. Mara, she thought her name was. His face had taken on a look she recognized. Not just control, containment. Like he was trying to keep a narrative in place that had already begun to crack. She imagined what he might be saying. Keep an eye on her. She's testing us. She's up to something. And, in a way, he wouldn't be wrong. Maylene looked down and pulled a small notepad from her coat pocket. It wasn't part of the mission. It was just something she always carried. Leftover habit from years of writing incident summaries after long flights. She uncapped her pen, paused for a second, then wrote, "Don't act out of anger. Act because the system must change." She tore the note free, folded it twice, and slipped it into her inside pocket. She didn't need to look at it again. It was more for her own anchor than any grand gesture. She was tempted, for a moment, to stand up and say something. To call Derek out directly. Let the whole cabin hear the truth. But she didn't. Because a single flame could light up a room, or burn the whole thing down. And this wasn't about fire. Not yet. Her mind drifted briefly to the others. The staff members on other flights running parallel inspections. She'd been the senior lead on this operation, but she wasn't the only one. If she blew her cover now, it could compromise every effort they were making across multiple routes and airlines. There was a bigger picture here, and it needed protecting. But that didn't mean she would stay quiet forever. Trenton passed by again, his glance toward her more intentional this time. He gave her a subtle nod, not one of solidarity exactly, but of awareness. He didn't know the full story, but he knew something wasn't right. That was enough for now. Somewhere up ahead, turbulence shifted the plane slightly. A ripple of motion ran through the aisle, and for a moment, it felt like a metaphor for everything. The balance had changed. She watched as Derek adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and tried to laugh at something Mara said. But the laugh didn't reach his eyes. He was trying to reclaim control of the cabin, of the moment, of the narrative. But it was slipping inch by inch. Maylene leaned back in her seat. She didn't smile, didn't frown. She just waited. Waiting wasn't always weakness. Sometimes it was timing. The hum of the plane wasn't enough to drown out the tension building in the cabin. It was quiet, yes, but the kind of quiet that made every breath louder, every movement sharper. Maylene felt it in the way eyes lingered just a second too long, in the way silence seemed to vibrate with suspicion. Derek stood in the galley, arms crossed, brow furrowed so hard it could have drawn lines into steel. Then he turned abruptly, striding back into the cabin like a man with a mission he believed would make him look like a hero. He stopped at row 3 again, gestured to Mara, and said just loud enough for the nearest few rows to hear, "Go ahead and ask her to stand. We'll need her cooperation." Mara hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward Maylene. There was uncertainty there, maybe even doubt, but she followed orders. She bent slightly, voice low but audible. "Ma'am, would you mind standing and stepping aside with us for a quick clarification?" Maylene didn't move right away. Her hand rested on her thigh, fingers curling once, then releasing. Her heart wasn't racing, but there was something in her chest that ached. Not from fear, from choice. She looked at Derek, then at Trenton, who had already stepped forward, invited into the theater of it all. This is the moment, she thought. Her voice was quiet, but firm. Are you formally accusing me of something? Derek didn't blink. We're investigating a possible case of duplicate ticket fraud. For the safety and assurance of all passengers, we need your cooperation. There it was. Fraud. Again. Mei-Ling rose slowly, gracefully, her movements unhurried but exact. She didn't look rattled. She looked tired, like someone who had waited long enough for the lesson to begin. She stepped into the aisle, straightened her coat, then reached into her inner pocket. What she pulled out wasn't a phone. It wasn't a boarding pass. It was a slim folder, navy blue, stamped with the gold emblem of the International Passenger Federation. She turned to Trenton, opened it without a word, and held it where he could read. I'm Mei-Ling Kersey, she said, loud enough for rows 1 through 6 to hear clearly. I'm the Director of Passenger Oversight at IPF. This flight is part of an undercover evaluation of customer experience standards across major international carriers. She looked at Derek next, her voice unwavering. This is my assignment, and unfortunately, it's already failed. The world didn't stop, but it did pause. Conversations halted. Eyelids blinked in delayed disbelief. Someone in 5C let out a low whistle. Trenton took the file in hand, scanning it, and visibly straightened. Derek opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Then he stammered, I was just following protocol. This wasn't about. Anyone could have. You assumed, Mei-Ling said, still calm, still steady, that someone like me didn't belong in this seat. Her eyes met his like a scalpel, not violent, but precise. You didn't need proof. You needed doubt. And that was enough for you to act. She turned back to Trenton. Thank you for staying professional. I know you sensed something was wrong. He swallowed, nodding once, his voice low. I should have spoken up sooner. I knew something was off. I just waited for proof. She gave him a look that wasn't cruel, but it wasn't soft either. Silence helps no one. Around them, no one spoke. Passengers sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether to applaud or avoid eye contact. Derek looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 minutes. His hands hung at his sides, useless. Mei-Ling took her folder back, tucked it away, and sat down again, gently, as if reclaiming something. She looked out the window, not to escape, but to breathe, to reclaim her center. Outside, clouds stretched across the horizon. Inside, power had quietly shifted. Trenton caught up to her at the back of the cabin, while passengers were beginning to gather their things. The seatbelt sign hadn't turned off yet, but people were already angling toward the aisles, stretching necks, opening overhead bins. Ms. Kersey, he said quietly, a little breathless, as if even speaking her real name now took effort. I've spoken to the captain. If you want to file a report at the arrival gate, they'll arrange for security and press to meet you. It can be handled immediately. Mei-Ling looked at him calmly, her hand resting on the top of her carry-on. Her voice was soft, but it didn't bend. No, she said. That's not what this moment needs. Trenton frowned. You could have a statement on record before we even clear customs. I'm not here to humiliate a man, she said, holding his gaze. I'm here to hold a system accountable. Trenton didn't argue. He just gave a slow nod, stepping back as if recognizing a boundary he hadn't seen before. She sat again, pulled out her phone, and scrolled to her secure app. Then, with the steadiness of someone who knew every step mattered, she uploaded a recording, her conversation with Derek, the tone in his voice, the baseless accusation, the entire sequence as it had happened, captured in real time by her device. She didn't write anything fancy in the email to IPF. Just 3 lines. Flight 0062. Behavior violated standards. Recommend full protocol audit. And she hit send. By the time the plane touched down at Lunsbury Heathrow, the message had already landed. What Mei-Ling didn't know yet, but would soon find out, was that Deanna Roth had already briefed the arrival team. She had shown the incoming message to 2 airline officials in the terminal, both of whom turned pale halfway through listening to the clip. So when Mei-Ling stepped off the jet bridge, She was met not by chaos or confrontation, but by presence. 3 representatives from Amerivoyage Airlines stood near Gate 9, 2 men and 1 woman in business suits, visibly tense. Behind them stood Deanna, holding her tablet and a quiet fire in her eyes. "Director Kersey," the woman said, offering a hand that was more ceremonial than sincere. "We'd like to invite you to a private room to discuss the matter." Maylie nodded. "Let's go." The walk through the terminal was quiet. Passengers filed out behind her, many still unaware of what had happened in the air. Maylie didn't need them to know. Not yet. In the VIP lounge, with walls of glass and brushed metal trim, they sat around a sleek table. Bottled water appeared. No one drank. The woman in the navy suit, Linda Farrell, Vice President of People and Performance, opened her notebook. Her tone tried for measured. "We're reviewing the situation thoroughly. Of course, we take every complaint seriously." Maylie didn't blink. "It wasn't a complaint." Farrell hesitated. "It was an inspection," Maylie continued, her voice calm but edged with steel. "And your lead flight attendant failed every measurable standard for professional conduct, anti-discrimination, and procedural clarity. We understand this is sensitive." "No," Maylie cut in, still even-toned. "It's not sensitive. It's systemic. And it needs to be addressed with more than a memo." Farrell opened her mouth again, then paused. "Well, the decision to remove an employee isn't immediate. We have to follow internal." Before she could finish, Deanna spoke, her voice clear and sharp. "With the IPF's authority and the agreement you signed last quarter, failure to take action in response to a breach documented during active evaluation is grounds for formal sanction, including downgrade in our service compliance ratings." Farrell's jaw tightened. "We're not threatening," Deanna added. "We're informing." The room went still. You could hear the faint hum of HVAC through the ceiling. Maylie spoke again, softer now. "I don't want public headlines. I want internal change. But make no mistake, I will escalate this if you hesitate." Farrell gave a small, forced nod. "Effective immediately, Mr. Vozen's employment is terminated, and we'll begin a top-down review of in-flight training standards." Maylie simply nodded. There was no triumph in her face, no satisfaction, just confirmation that the message had finally landed. Later, as she stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the tarmac, she saw another plane lift into the gray afternoon sky. She didn't watch it long. She wasn't here for takeoffs anymore. She was here to make sure they knew who was watching when they landed. The VIP lounge had thinned out. Half-finished drinks sat forgotten on tables. Ambient music played to no one in particular, and the air had the strange stillness that follows a storm. Somewhere down the corridor, behind frosted glass doors, HR staff were quietly typing up the formal termination letter. But none of that noise made it into the corner of the room where Derek stood. He wasn't holding anything now, no clipboard, no authority, no distraction. Just himself, alone, still in uniform, but it no longer meant anything. Maylie saw him before he saw her. He was angled toward the wall of windows, eyes unfocused, jaw tight like he was trying to swallow a bitter taste that wouldn't go down. She could have walked past, easily. She had earned that right. But she didn't. She slowed, stepping to a stop 3 feet away, close enough that he'd hear her words, far enough that he couldn't mistake them as personal. He still didn't look at her. His eyes hovered somewhere behind her shoulder, pretending to study the tarmac. The truth was, he had nothing to say, and too much to lose if he tried. She let the silence hang, let him feel its shape. "You didn't lose your job because of me," she said finally, her tone even and low. "You lost it because of how you think people like me should be treated." The words weren't sharp, but they cut anyway. He blinked just once. A twitch in his jaw betrayed him. Maybe he wanted to deny it. Maybe he didn't know how. Maylie didn't wait. Whatever apology he might have given, whatever defense he might have whispered, would have been for himself, not her. She walked on. Out in the terminal, the world moved like nothing had happened. Travelers bustled toward gates, dragging luggage, clutching coffee cups, eyes locked on departure screens. Business as usual. But beyond the sliding glass doors, something had shifted. Trenton was already waiting by the curb, standing beside a sleek black SUV. He looked different now. Not in uniform, but in stance. Shoulders less rigid, chin higher. There was something unspoken in the way he stood, like he understood now what he'd missed before. As she approached, he opened the car door and nodded once. "I've seen a lot of tension on planes," he said quietly. "Fights, breakdowns, power trips. But I've never seen someone shift an entire room without ever raising their voice." Maylene paused before stepping in. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something behind her eyes, something between resolve and fatigue. "You don't have to be loud," she replied. "You just have to be clear. People feel the difference." Trenton let the words settle. Then he hesitated, brows knitting. "What happens now?" She looked back at the terminal for a moment. The world inside moved like it always had. But not everything was the same. "Now," she said softly. "Now they know someone's watching. That's how systems start to change, not with noise, but with notice." He nodded slowly. "Well, you've got mine." She didn't smile, not exactly, but her eyes lingered on him, as if to say she appreciated the weight behind that sentence more than any formal thank you. Then she stepped into the SUV. The door shut with a soft click. Inside, the car was quiet and dim, the window tint muting the airport lights to soft streaks across the glass. She didn't pull out her phone, didn't reach for work. She just leaned back and let herself be still. Memories came, not loud ones, not cinematic, just small things that stacked on top of each other. Years of flights. The long shifts, the fake smiles, the sideways comments. The passengers who judged her on sight. The managers who told her to be the bigger person. The women who'd broken down in galley corners after being screamed at for things that weren't their fault. And she thought of Derek. Men like him never thought they were cruel. That was the problem. They called it procedure, policy, security. But really it was fear, the kind dressed up as professionalism. And finally, it had caught up with him. Back at IPF headquarters, a notification had already gone out. Flight 0062, emergency evaluation complete. Immediate systemic review required. Priority high. No headlines. No press conferences. Just a system being forced to look at itself. For once. Maylene closed her eyes. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't slammed a single door. But when she stood up, the ground shifted anyway. 1 week after Flight 0062, the buzz outside Maylene's office was loud in that polished, professional kind of way. Heels clicked across tile, elevators chimed on every floor, and email notifications blinked endlessly across every screen. Somewhere in the building, someone was presenting a deck with 20 bullet points on proposed alignment. Someone else was talking over a phone headset about optics. But in Maylene's corner office at IPF headquarters in Washington, D.C., there was only stillness. She hadn't turned on the overhead lights. The February afternoon filtered in through half-drawn blinds, painting her desk in soft silver tones. A folder sat open in front of her, thick, dog-eared, filled with field reports, observation logs, audio transcripts, and first-hand accounts from anonymous inspectors and passengers. But Maylene wasn't reading any of those. Her fingers rested on a single sheet, set apart from the others. A handwritten note, uneven script on a feedback card, written in haste, but with care. "I stayed silent when I knew something was wrong. But watching that woman, I realized silence is a choice, and it's never neutral." She read it again, slower this time. Folded the page carefully, with 2 hands like it was something sacred. And then she leaned back, letting her shoulders sink into the chair, her breath slowing. That single comment had landed harder than any policy report. It reminded her of why she'd taken this job, not just to monitor behavior, but to change what behavior meant. It had also reminded her of something else, that the question of when to speak and when to wait had haunted her for most of her career. There were years when she thought silence was strength, that restraint was what leadership looked like, that biting your tongue meant you'd earned a seat at the table. But Flight 0062 had changed that. Now she understood the nuance. Silence could be armor, but it could also be compliance. Sometimes The hardest thing wasn't shouting. It was knowing when to say just enough and no more. And on that flight, she had said just enough. At the right time, in the right tone. Her inbox pinged, cutting into her thoughts. She reached for the keyboard, opened the newest message, final enforcement findings from the IPF committee. She scrolled, eyes skimming, until they landed on the line that mattered. Mr. Derek Voisin has waived his right to internal appeal. Termination upheld. No drama. No fanfare. Just closure. She read on. Additional internal review revealed a previous incident involving a Latings female passenger, mishandled and suppressed at the supervisory level. Full investigation now underway. So, it hadn't been a one-time slip. It was a pattern finally exposed. And now, there would be a paper trail. One that couldn't be buried under standard procedure. She closed the document and sat in the quiet for a long moment. Elsewhere in the building, Deanna Roth was packing up her things. She'd come to Maylene 3 days earlier, knocking lightly on the glass door before stepping in. "I want to be out in the field," she'd said, no hesitation. "I don't want to just monitor change anymore. I want to help cause it." Maylene had said very little in return, only nodded slowly. Deanna didn't need a speech. She had already crossed the threshold. And Trenton, he hadn't scheduled a meeting. Just sent a one-line email. "If you think there's room, I'd like to help train the next team." There were no attachments. No signature block. Just intent. Maylene had forwarded it to HR with a 2-word note. "He's ready." And now across departments, across terminals and time zones, something real was happening. Not a rebrand. Not a task force. A shift. IPF was launching its first in-field curriculum for cultural sensitivity and procedural integrity in airline enforcement. Not because it was a trending topic, but because 2 people, one who had stayed silent too long and one who had learned the cost of doubt, had been moved enough to act. None of them had asked for recognition, and Maylene had offered none. The work, after all, wasn't about applause. It was about alignment, of values, of voices, of impact. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out the old brown leather notebook she had carried since her early days in the air. Its spine was cracked, its pages bent, but it was still whole. She opened it to the very first page. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. Change doesn't start with a microphone. It starts with someone who refuses to look away. She closed the notebook and stood. Outside her window, the wind had picked up. People hurried along the sidewalks in coats and scarves, heads down against the cold. She watched them for a beat. Everyone going somewhere. Everyone wrapped in their own momentum. She turned off her monitor, slipped the notebook into her bag, straightened her jacket, and stepped into the hallway, not as a woman who'd just won, but as someone who had simply done what needed to be done. She didn't feel victorious. She felt useful. And, in her world, that meant more. So what does it really take to change a system? Sometimes it's not a protest or a headline. It's a quiet stand, made at the right moment, by someone who refuses to look away. Maylene didn't raise her voice, but she raised a mirror, and the system had no choice but to look back. What would you have done in her place? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. More stories are coming, each with a quiet truth waiting to be heard.